Right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the April 19th session of the ABA Legal Education Police Practices Consortium Fellowship Meeting. Woo. We are reaching the end of our semester, and it has been a full one. So I want to thank the students for continuing to show up, and obviously all of the speakers that we have had participating, as well as the ones we have to hear from this evening. One of my goals from this semester was to hear from a lot of different think and do tanks, individuals who are currently working in this space to get a better understanding of different policing technologies, how they are currently being used, and if and how they are working in tandem with how we have historically identified what it means to have a community-oriented approach to policing and public safety. In these conversations throughout the semester, I feel like we have identified a number of challenges that these technologies provide to us as legal scholars, as individuals who are invested in the safety of our community, as those interested in just general crime and safety issues. And so for our final session today, in hearing from an external speaker, I was hoping to, we'll see which way the conversation takes us, but to look at more of the solutions side of things. So how some organizations are identifying these issues and looking to work in support of a solution that works for the majority of the community. And so it was with that in mind that I reached out to the Justice Innovation Lab and are delighted this evening to be joined by Jared Fishman. Jared, you'll forgive me, I pulled up a bio that you can feel free to contradict if any of this is inaccurate. But Mr. Fishman, prior to joining the Justice Innovation Lab, served for 14 years as a prosecutor in the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. He led some of the most complex civil rights prosecutions in the country, securing convictions in cases involving high-profile police misconduct, hate crimes, and human trafficking. He received multiple awards from the Civil Rights Division for distinguished service, including the division's highest award for excellence in legal advocacy. Fishman earned his law degree from the George Washington University Law School here in DC, and his bachelor's degree from the University of Pennsylvania. He began his career at the US State Department, where he worked to rebuild legal systems in post-war Kosovo, and is now with the Justice Innovation Lab. So Jared, thank you for being with us this evening and for giving us more insight into the work of your organization, as well as hopefully how going forward we can continue to support the great work that you are doing, both either through partnership with y'all or at the individual level.
All right. Well, thanks for having me. So everyone here is a law student, is that right? Where are you at law school? Pop them in the chat, or you can just say it.
So I'm all the way in Boston. I go to Suffolk University.
And I'm at Drexel in Pennsylvania, Philly here. I transferred from New England Law, which is right next door to Suffolk. But yeah.
Me and Melody are over at Wayne State University in Detroit.
All right.
And I'm just a professor nerd that likes to hang out in Jesselyn's class. I'm at Lincoln Memorial University in Knoxville, Tennessee.
All right, a Zoom bomber. Been a while since I've had one of them in one of my talks. All right, I am going to share my screen. I have some slides, and hopefully we can keep this fun tonight, because as I said, it's happy hour, and it's Friday afternoon. It's been a long week. So when I was preparing my slides today, I always look to see what the speech that I am supposed to be giving is titled, and I saw that it was entitled "Forecasting the Future of Algorithms and AI in the Criminal Legal System." I'm not entirely sure how that became the title. Certainly not necessarily the expertise that I feel the strongest at. So I then thought about rebranding what I was talking about to building a values-driven, data-informed justice system, which is really more akin to what I do and what Jess's Innovation Lab does. But of course, that sounds kind of boring too. And it is Friday afternoon, and this is the last class. So today's presentation is called What Will It Take to Change the World? This is the Justice Innovation Lab approach to trying to solve some of the serious problems that are facing our justice system. So let me start by telling you a little bit about myself. I started off early in my career working in war zones. As a young kid, I grew up in a social justice family that very much imparted into me the desire and responsibility that the world was broken and that we had an obligation to fix it. And so I decided to take on what I thought were the most broken parts of the world, which were places that had been destroyed in conflict, in war. And I spent my early days in the Middle East, in Bosnia-Herzegovina, in Kosovo. And I was working, and I ultimately went to law school to try to answer some of these questions about, can we use law? Can we use the rule of law? Can we use some of these ideals that are baked into our legal system to help countries prevent war? I did that work for a bit of time, and I was in Kosovo at one point, and I was working with someone who said to me, listen, I understand that you want to try to fix the broken legal system here in Kosovo, but you're right out of law school. You've never done anything. You don't know anything. You probably need to go work in a system first. And I said, all right, well, that's good advice. I'm going to go be a public defender. I care too much about civil rights. And he said to me, listen, kid, yeah, he didn't say that, but works better. But he said to me, kid, if you want to change that system, you should be a prosecutor because they're the ones with all the power. I didn't really think about this that way at that time. And fortunately, because of the way I'd been hired into the State Department, where I was doing work in this post-war work, I was able to rotate to the U.S. Attorney's Office in Washington, D.C., which, for those of you who are not that familiar with how D.C. is different, the U.S. Attorney's Office in D.C., in addition to doing the federal cases that you most typically would know about a U.S. Attorney's Office doing, they also are the district attorney for Washington, D.C. And so I handled cases of domestic violence and sex crimes, and was very much on the front row of how we were policing Washington, D.C. circa 2005. And what became very clear to me is that most of the people in our system were Black or brown. Most of the people in our system were coming from rather low income communities. We saw a lot of people who were suffering from mental health and addiction challenges, and quite frankly, just from poverty. And so it became very hard to me to think about enforcing the law and using this prosecutorial power, recognizing how unequal the system was and how it felt. But I turned out, even though I had no intention ever of being a prosecutor, that I was really good at it. This might find many people hard to believe, but I never took trial ad when I was in law school. I had no intention of ever going and being a real lawyer. I was going to go build legal systems. So now all of a sudden I'm in court, I'm a prosecutor, and I said, all right, well, if I'm going to use this power, what should I use it for? And I then got hired to go work at the Civil Rights Division, where my job was to do cases on behalf of the most marginalized communities in America, people who had been attacked because of their race or their religion or their national origin, people who were exploited either for labor or for sex, and people who had their constitutional rights taken away from them by a member of law enforcement. Fast forward many years, near the very end of my career, I'm standing on the steps of the courthouse in Charleston, South Carolina, after what was undoubtedly the biggest victory of my career. I was the lead federal prosecutor on the investigation of the murder of a man named Walter Scott, who was killed by a white North Charleston police officer. For those of you who might not remember this is back in 2015. It was one of the police misconduct cases that helped spark and mobilize the Black Lives Matter movement in 2015, in part because it was one of the first cases that was vividly captured on video. A barber named Faden Santana was on his way to work, took out his cell phone, and managed to capture this shooting that showed this officer firing 8 shots at Walter Scott as he ran away. The state failed to get a conviction in that case. There was a hung jury, and I had been asked to lead the team to come in and lead the federal case. Ultimately, Michael Slager pled guilty after some very astute maneuvering in the pretrial process, and ultimately he was sentenced to 20 years incarceration. It was called a murder, and it was one of the longest sentences ever given to a police officer for the constitutional deprivations of a citizen's rights. And so with this huge victory, you saw things like this. Front page of the newspaper called it a monumental day for civil rights. The Scott family talked about how they had not only had justice been achieved, but the truth had been told. And you would think that a young civil rights prosecutor, I guess I wasn't that young anymore by this point, but a civil rights prosecutor, like, this is the stuff that you dream about. You like immediately get that one framed and pop it on your office at the office, pop it on your wall at the office. But as I was standing there that day, in the wake of this victory, I realized that I had this emptiness. It was not the feeling that you expect to have when you have this really big victory, and I think it was in part because it hit me working these cases over so many years. In the 2.5 years it took us to investigate and prosecute the Walter Scott murder, 2,500 other people died in confrontations with the police. Like, I knew that the very next day that the policies and procedures and processes that contributed to Walter Scott's death, such as the use of pretextual traffic stops, were going to continue the next day, no matter what. And I knew that no matter what we achieved, we were never going to be able to bring Walter back for his family. Now, when you have these feelings of sadness after your biggest victory of your career, you begin to realize that you need a new job. It is hard to continue doing this work when your biggest victories don't feel like a success. But I didn't know what to do. I really struggled. I looked for a bunch of jobs out there in the world, and I couldn't find any that I actually wanted to do. But I stayed in touch with the prosecutor in Charleston, and one day she called me up on the phone. We were a bit of an odd couple. She is a Republican elected law and order DA down in Charleston, South Carolina. I was her lefty civil rights friend, but we liked working with each other, and I think we respected each other, and we did not doubt each other's motives. But we recognized that we came to this conversation from different angles. And perhaps by talking about these things, maybe we would come up with some solutions. So one day she called me up. What was interesting about her was this is about 2018 at that time. She had been collecting data on prosecutorial decision points throughout her office, everything to recognize who was being arrested, what were they being charged with, what were the continuances that were happening, who pled guilty, what were the sentences, and so on and so forth. And she'd been collecting all this data, and she said, listen, I want to use this, but I don't have any capacity. In particular, what I want to use this data is to figure out this question. Whoops. Are we being fair? I thought this was a pretty, I mean, you got to go back to 2018. This is pre-George Floyd. The Black Lives Matter movement is happening. Charleston is very unstable at that moment, not only from this very racially charged police shooting, but also because of the massacre of 9 Black parishioners at Emmanuel AME Church, where a white supremacist walked into a Bible study group and murdered 9 people and injured 2 others. And so the community was definitely on edge, and there was a desire to reflect at its processes, its systems, to understand what is happening and where could the individual actors in the system do better. And so Scarlett asked me, are we being fair? And she wanted to use her data. And I said, I am going to help you do this. There was just one problem. I didn't know anything about data. I was a prosecutor, and like many lawyers, became a lawyer because I didn't particularly like math. My dad was an accountant. He wanted me to go into the accounting, and I'm like, it really does this for me. So first, I had to learn a little bit about data. And as it turns out, it's not that complicated. And at a high level, this is what I have come to learn, is that data is really all about counting. But if you are going to use data effectively for decision making, for advocacy, you need to do two things. Number one, you have to be able to rely that the information that you are looking at is accurate. And number two, you need to make sure that you are counting the right things. So I want to start by talking about what I saw earlier in my career at the State Department about counting the wrong things. But when I was at State Department, this was early in 2004, 2005, the US was having a war with Iraq at the time. Even though the war was still ongoing, we were doing post-war rule of law reconstruction. And one of the things that we wanted to do was bring the rule of law to Iraq. But because there were a lot of business folk in the administration, they had come to this idea of metrics that we need to count. We need to see whether or not we are achieving the rule of law in Iraq. And my favorite metric that we analyzed in those days was the number of courthouses we had built. I mean, it's certainly something one can count, but for those of you who have spent any time in a courthouse, I think it is safe to say that the number of courthouse does not equal the quality of justice that you might see inside it. So if we're going to look at the justice system, particularly whether or not we are being fair, and we are going to count the things that enable us to figure that out, what would you count? A prosecutor comes to you with all of their data, free rein, and says, tell me if we are being fair. So I'm going to open this part up for questions. What would you want to count to even determine whether or not you're being fair?
I'm thinking like perception of fairness following an interaction, or general sentiments following interaction with the legal system.
And how do you count that?
On a scale of 1 to 10, I love a Likert scale. What was your impression of your interaction with a certain individual?
I mean, we actually say, yeah, sure. Like, well, let's treat it like a Yelp review. What is your experience with the American criminal justice system? Or star, it was terrible. I had a terrible experience. We could totally poll the people who are interacting with our system to figure out whether or not they think it's fair. What else would you want to count?
Like, I guess like a problematic metric and then just the quantity of it. So like maybe plea deals, like they're not always that great. So if we have a lot of that, maybe that shows a different issue. Perhaps.
Sure.
I mean, yeah, any problematic metric and then just a lot of it. Yeah.
Well, and it can be problematic for different levels, right? You could study whether the case came in at and whether or not the prosecutor's offices were charging or downcharging. Now, that might not necessarily tell you who is good or who is bad, but at least it shows you the direction that things are moving. You could also look at outcomes based on some demographic, like race or gender or national origin or zip code or poverty level or access to public or private counsel, right? You can slice these things in many different ways to try to figure out whether a particular decision, in the case that you mentioned, plea bargaining, is fair or unfair. Who else has something they want to count?
I would consider, like they mentioned, the demographics, especially if you're dealing with something like overseas, you might want to take into consideration the different religions and the percentages of each religion in the area as well, and maybe a little bit about what their practices are, how they would go about that to just treat them fairly.
Right. I mean, one thing is even figuring out how are you counting the numbers of people. And one way we can count things is by raw number, the total number of people who go through something. We can count things by per capita. So if we see a group is having a large percentage, like how are they represented in the general public for that number? What else? Anyone else have something they want to count? I mean, we could really count anything. Like one of the things that we think is sort of interesting when we talk about effectiveness is, we know that 60%, close to 60% of people who are victimized by violent crime aren't even reporting it. They do not trust the system such that they are not using what we have available to help them. This is pretty profound if you think about what crime means, and particularly when I talk to a lot of prosecutors, we always start a lot of our meetings by asking, why did you do this? Why did you become a prosecutor? Why did you enter into the law? What were you hoping to accomplish? And a lot of them say, well, I want to help victims. And they'll talk about someone who was victimized and who was saved by the system or was helped by the system. Well, 60% of people who were having that experience aren't even coming to us. What does that say about whether or not we're being fair, whether or not we're being effective? One of the things that I've really liked looking at, particularly now, as there's been a lot of backlash about the rise of crime and whether or not being more fair and being more progressive is actually causing more crime. What we also know is at the same time, we've seen dramatically reduced rates in the ability to solve our most serious crimes, whether it's a homicide, particularly non-fatal shootings in many jurisdictions are being solved less than a third, maybe even less than a quarter of the time. So are we looking at the right things? Like, are we being effective? What is the purpose of our system? If the purpose of our system is to drive public safety, if the purpose of our system is to be one that is fair and just, like we got to make sure that we are counting and measuring the right things. I mean, another thing that a lot of people often are interested in is recidivism. Like, are people staying out of the system? And in one study recently, it showed that prosecuting people increased the likelihood they were going to be rearrested for a similar subset of people. So if our goal as prosecutors or as law enforcement is to increase safety, surely we should not be doing a thing that makes it more likely for people to reoffend. So Scarlett asked us to figure out what we should. Scarlett is Scarlett Wilson. She is the solicitor in Charleston, South Carolina. Everyone calls her Scarlett. But she wanted to answer this question about fairness. And so we looked at all sorts of things. I mean, one of the things that I wanted to look at was the level of incarceration coming out of any particular office. How many people were being sentenced to incarceration in a given year? And what did that mean? And one of the things that we found that was really interesting was that in a given year, in 2019, which was the first year of data that we looked at when we started, the jurisdiction was sentencing people to 4,000 years of incarceration per year. That means every year, if you took the number of sentences, everything running from the 1-day sentence to the 15-day sentence to the 100-day sentence, and you added them all up and included the 100-year sentence, you get 4,000. Now, that number is nuts if you think about it in terms of just sheer human years that are going to incarceration, because this is what is happening this year, right? Next year, if you do the same thing, it's going to be another 4,000 years and another 4,000 years. In addition to the human the human harm that comes with it, there is a monetary cost, because in the state of South Carolina, even though they don't spend much on their inmates, they're still spending $34,000 a year per inmate. And if you multiply $34,000 a year by 4,000, you get $136 million. So if you want to frame what is the cost of the status quo, how much is it costing us to incarcerate people and our future selves, right? Because this is going to be paid out in the future, $136 million. And the question that I think communities have to be asking is that how we want to be spending our money? Are we spending our money on the solutions that bring us public safety and that help raise our community? So one of the ways that we like to think about this is helping people get their priorities in line with their values. So As I mentioned before, Scarlett cared about fairness, she cared about public safety. And one of the things we always like to do is have an office, a community, a police department rank the charges that they see in order of priority. So, for example, we will give them 5 charges at a time. We have like a fun app, it's interactive, and we'll say, all right, put these in order of priority. And you get your murder, you put your murder on top, and then you're like, my armed robbery is probably here, and then my serious drug dealing is here, and my possession is here, and traffic offenses are at the bottom, right? And then I give you 5 more and you do it again. And you do this enough time, and you do this with a large enough sample of people, you can wind up creating a list of the office's priority. And as this may or may not surprise people, it comes out relatively similar every place we do it. People put homicide at the top, they put sexual assault at the top, they put armed carjacking and violent aggravated assault at the top, they put possessory drug offenses, shoplifting, and traffic at the bottom. Right? This should not be surprising if we're thinking about how are we going to be using our $136 million of incarceration. Presumably, we want to be spending that money on the things that are the biggest priority and the most serious threats to public safety and wellness in our communities. But what do we see? This is from one jurisdiction. You can see how much incarceration is coming out of the small choices, the things like shoplifting under $2,000, the possession, and ultimately how much that costs. Again, this is every year, the incarceration costs of doing these things. And if you haven't spent a lot of time in the justice system and you have only watched Law and Order, you would be forgiven for thinking that the cases in our system are the murders and rapes that we care the most about. That is not who is in our system for the most part. We see a lot of people on low-level offenses, such as small-level drug dealing and shoplifting, and we see a lot of people who are suffering from mental health challenges. We see a lot of people who are suffering from addiction, and it comes with a very serious cost. So what else did we learn when we were looking at their numbers? One of the things that we learned, we were looking at, of all the people who enter the system, how many of the cases are they just dismissing? Are the prosecutors deciding should not be in the system? And we looked at a particular subset of cases that prosecutors were dismissing for insufficient evidence, because the discovery was never provided, because this case failed to meet the elements. And what they found is 1 in 4 were being dismissed for having that kind of failure. Now, that is a comment on policing, because the police are the ones who are bringing these cases to the prosecutor's office. They don't decide who gets arrested in South Carolina. They process the case once it comes in. And so 1 in 4 of these cases are being dismissed in their entirety, which signals some sort of problem. Either, if this case is really important, because it is a public safety priority, then we want the police to go get the right evidence. You know, did they collect all the video? Did they interview the witnesses? Did they have the officers who are going to be ready to show up when we need them? And for the cases that are crappy cases to begin with, then we want those cases out of our system as quickly as possible for the defendants' families, and for the prosecutors and law enforcement themselves. We don't want them spending resources on these cases that should not be in the system. But as bad as the distribution was this. It was taking them over 220 days to identify and remove these cases. So what does that mean? If you are in jail during that time, if you are being held, you are going to continue to be detained most likely for a long time, even on a case that doesn't merit it. But what we also know is a lot of people in that circumstance will plead guilty to get out of jail, whether or not they did the crime or not, or whether or not the government can prove it. What we also know is that most of these people have to pay some sort of bond to get themselves out. Usually it's 5 to 10% of whatever is set. That is money you never get back, regardless of what happens with your case. All right, that's pretty major downstream consequences. And for people who have an arrest pending over your head, you could lose your job, you could lose your housing. there's a lot of negative downstream impact. But what else did we learn? We also learned it was taking 67 days longer if you were Black to get removed from the system than if you were white. A striking racial difference. Now, some people could look at these numbers and say this is proof that the people in this office are racist, that these people in this office want to punish defendants, and it's easy to turn to individual intent. But what I see in numbers this large is a system problem. This is a problem that exists independent of the individual choices that people are making. And we need to approach systems problems with a different way of thinking. Now, the good news is there is a different way of thinking about changing systems. This might surprise you. It's called systems thinking. All right, for those of you who've never dealt with systems thinking before, I'm going to give you a quick overview because I think these are pretty fundamental ways of rethinking how we talk about the problems of a system, and more importantly, ultimately how we're going to fix them. So, what is a system? A system is an interconnected set of elements organized to achieve a purpose. As you can tell, that is an incredibly broad definition. It is hard to think of a thing that doesn't meet this definition, right? You can think about your class as a system, your law school as a system, your family as a system. All of these things that have interconnected sets of elements where your goal is to connect some purpose. And it doesn't even matter what that purpose is. Sometimes it's explicit, sometimes it's not. Figuring out what your purpose is usually a good starting point. It's why I think the values-driven method of thinking is pretty important. Whatever system you are thinking about, you should know what it cares about most. What is its purpose? All right. There's a saying in systems thinking that systems are perfectly designed to achieve the results they are currently achieving. So rather than getting angry at a system that is producing outcomes that are inconsistent with what you want, particularly where your outcomes are inconsistent with your purpose and your values, the thing is to step back and say, okay, well, we are getting this result precisely because the system was designed in a particular way. And it's also important to note that a system is not the sum of its parts, but the product of its interactions. So to tie all of this together and explain what is systems thinking, at its key, it's about understanding the interactions between different parts of the system so that you can achieve your desired outcomes. So that's what we started to do in Charleston, South Carolina, was to try to understand what is happening in the system, and particularly understanding more about the relationship between the police that were bringing the case, the prosecutors who were having to make decisions about what to do with the case. Because back on the racial disparities, what we found in our initial analysis of a lot of the different prosecutorial decisions was that when you look at the probability of an outcome, which is often what we use when we're trying to figure out if the system itself is being fair, are people being treated differently because of their race, for example? Do they have a probability of having a higher or a lower outcome because of one of those factors? What we found is that overall, the prosecutors were treating similarly situated people similarly, right? On the whole, if you had a Black person in a situation and a white person in a situation, they were getting similar outcomes when you consider things like what were the charges, what was their criminal history, and so on and so forth. But when you look at the raw number, when you look at the raw number of people who get an incarceratory sentence, or you look at the raw number of who's having having long sentences, it's disproportionately people of color. In South Carolina, it tends to be Black men. So the question is, how is this possible? How is it possible that you can be treating similarly situated people similarly and still getting these really unequal outcomes downstream? And the answer went back to, well, that depends on what is coming into the system. And what we saw is if you were Black in Charleston, you were 5 times more likely to be arrested. The numbers went up to about 6 if you were 6 times more likely if you were just looking at drug offenses. And the numbers go up even higher if we're looking at how people under the age of 30 are treated. And that's because of policing decisions that are being made about where the law is being enforced, and who is being arrested for it. And as a result, what we saw also when looking at some of their numbers is that they were dismissing cases for Black people at a significantly higher rate, which to us indicated that they were coming in with way weaker cases. That as the wide policing net had been cast, it means that you get a lot more of what we call the marginal case, the defendant who would not have wound up in the system in a normal system, but has now wound up. And we see that those marginal cases tend to lack evidence and tend to be weaker. So using a systems thinking approach and understanding where the prosecutorial power lay and where the policing influence lay, we started looking at, well, how does a case even come into the system? Literally, like, what is their intake process? What happens from the point that someone is arrested? Well, they go to court, there's a bond hearing. Well, was there a prosecutor there? Most of the time, not. So if it gets through the case, it then gets assigned to a paralegal, who then assigns it to the appropriate deputy, who may or may not be in court for the next 2 weeks, who then assigns it to a junior attorney, who may or may not be in court for the next 2 weeks. And maybe 5 weeks later, someone looks at this case for the first time, but probably not. They're most likely going to wait until there's a status hearing 60 days from now. Right, just think about that, right? This case has now moved through the system, touched a bunch of hands, and it's lacking in evidence, and nothing happened with it. So using that systems thinking approach and thinking about the levers that were available to that office, they decided, all right, we are going to put a screener early in the process. Now, that person isn't going to screen everything. We don't have the resources for it. We're going to come up with a list of things that we think they can review quickly. And we're going to give you one half-time prosecutor to look at it. Well, what happened was pretty dramatically. By putting in a screener, they began dismissing cases at a higher percentage of the cases, recognizing that when focused on the evidentiary quality of a case, they could get rid of a lot of cases. And what they also saw is, wow, we get a lot worse drug cases than we do other cases. So this was an interesting revelation that some of the problems of the cases that were coming in had to do with drug enforcement. What we also saw is that by doing the screening process, the cases they were dismissing tended to be, as we suspected, primarily for Black male defendants who were being arrested on way worse cases far more frequently. Well, they saw how successful this pilot project was, and they expanded it to include 2 screeners, a lot more charges in every police department that reported to them. In addition to doing it, they decided, well, we want to study this. We actually set it up as a randomized control trial, which to my understanding is the first time anyone has ever set up a randomized control trial for a prosecutorial intervention. And what we are seeing, it's still going to run through November, but we are seeing substantial reduction in time. The median is now down to 30 days to dismiss a case for insufficient evidence. Not only that, this feedback loop that they have created with the police department means that cases are coming ready with discovery at a higher clip, and that people are able to make these decisions one way or the other very quickly. One of the really interesting things that we are also seeing is that if you get your case dismissed early compared to someone who gets their cases dismissed much later in the process, you are less likely to reoffend. You're less likely to wind up in the system. Again, sort of showing just how punitive and harsh just being in the system can be for people. And what have we seen over the course of the last 2 years? They've reduced incarceration by about 2,000 years per year. 2,000 years. It was 1,000 a year for 2 years running, with a future savings of about $64 million. This is a minor intervention. Now, we can't say that the screening takes credit for all of those years. There were a number of different interventions that are taking place simultaneously, including one that's looking at backlog reduction and the changes in policing. But what we also saw in those years was crime in this community actually went down. Now, we're not claiming causal effect, because I actually don't think the amount of time that we incarcerate people for has any deterrent effect on whether or not people are committing crimes. At the end of the day, what is convincing people not to commit crimes is the likelihood they're going to be caught. So when we do a better job at solving our homicides, when we do a better job at solving our non-fatal shootings, that is what actually drives the reduction in crime. That being said, when we reduce the incarceration, we can save a lot of money that can be better spent in other places. What we're seeing other jurisdictions doing is saying, all right, well, we're going to try to take some of that savings and we want to do better victim outreach. We want to do better mental health identification early in the phase, and trying to get people services earlier in the process that can help them address things like mental health in a way more cost-effective, humane, and just generally more effective way. And it seems like this approach is generally not that controversial. My favorite thing that anyone said about us was the Charleston Post-Courier, it's South Carolina's leading newspaper. There is a common sense approach that we can take to improve the outcomes that we care about in our communities. We can have safer communities. We can have more fair communities. This doesn't have to be a choice between being fair and being safe. It is often framed that way in the media narrative, and it is a false narrative that I think we should reject. Now, part of the reason why we were able to accomplish what we were able to accomplish in South Carolina was also probably the most revolutionary thing that we did, which is we walked into South Carolina and we met them where they were at. We walked into this place understanding that they understood their jurisdiction and how it functioned, that we had skills and perspectives that we were able to offer that would help them see things that they may not have understood. And we took the time to have conversations with them to hear where they were at. And honestly, in a back and forth situation where we would show them numbers and we say, do you think this could be right? And sometimes they would say, that number cannot be right. So we dig deeper into the data, and sometimes that number was not right. And so we were able to get it right, understanding how their practice went. But sometimes that number was right. And the fact that we found the number and it startled them into thinking, okay, this is not what we are going for. And so when you can have these conversations where you're really driven by the values, I know what they care about. I believe that they care about the things they say. I can help them count those things. And ultimately, when they find things that they don't like, we can help them fix it using this systems approach. What I like about all of this is it's not political, it's not partisan. We often talk to all of our folks. You have an idea about what you think is happening? We say, take a hypothesis mindset. If you think you can explain the 200-day difference, the 200-day delay, what is your hypothesis? What do you think is happening? I'll tell you my hypothesis. I might be wrong. You might be wrong. We both might be a little bit right. But when you take this approach, it wasn't personal. Wasn't, when we said, well, there's this 67-day disparity between Black and white people. What do you think might be causing it? Well, I think it might be because Black people have public defenders more often. I think this is an issue of public versus private counsel. Totally legitimate hypothesis. Wasn't what was happening. But it was a legitimate hypothesis that we could study and rule out. As we moved on and began to see success in South Carolina, we found that lots of other jurisdictions are interested in similar things. I cared a lot about pretextual traffic stops. Initially, when I got interested in pretextual traffic stops through the Walter Scott case, he had been stopped for a non-public safety broken taillight. He was pulled over at the time because that was the policy of the department. We're just going to pull people over for whatever we can. And the philosophy was we can use this tool that is legally within our arsenal to try to proactively fight crime. So if you think a little bit about policing and the justification for things like pretextual traffic stops, the argument goes like this. There are communities in our country that disproportionately see large amounts of violence. homicides, aggravated assaults, right? That tends to be concentrated in particular neighborhoods. Those neighborhoods tend to have concentrated poverty, and those neighborhoods tend to have disproportionality, are disproportionately Black or brown. And so when they say, all right, we need to proactively take things into our own hands because we want to stop this, we're going to use every tool. So what do? They use things like pretextual traffic stops to pull people over for broken taillights. But the real goal is to maybe find a gun. Well, what we see across the country is this is happening less than 1% of the time, that you're actually seizing a weapon. It's pretty extreme. So what does that mean? That means 99% of the time that you're stopping someone in one of these communities, you're not finding a weapon, but you're stopping them. You might be giving them a ticket. You might be arresting them on something like a suspended license because they couldn't pay for their last ticket. We saw in one community, 9,000 people got arrested for driving on a suspended license, but they're only solving 1/3 of their homicides. Question whether or not the police resources are being spent in the right places. But what St. Paul, Minnesota decided was, you know what? I don't think this works. Like, we don't think that this is a smart use of our resources. So we are going to stop using pretextual traffic stops, and we're going to reallocate our resources to traffic safety. We're going to only stop people for things that we think are actually jeopardizing traffic safety. And as a result of this study, we showed that they could stop doing this very ineffective policing strategy. And guess what? The next year, they seized just as many guns. And at the same time, they also saw their crime rates drop. And why this is particularly important is when you're stopping 99% of the people for no reason, guess what? Who live in dangerous neighborhoods, who live in the place where the violence is, they're the witnesses. They are the victims of these crimes. They are the 60% of the people who don't call us when they're in trouble. And so what we begin to see is communities trying to think, what do we really care about? How do we count it? And where in our system are there levers that we can do something about it? Our motto at Justice Innovation Lab is really three-part. That you got to start by understanding the world as it is, understanding what is happening on the grounds in the community, and really listen. Like, listen to all sorts of different perspectives: law enforcement, community members, high income, low income, because we have to really understand what is happening on the ground, and then we got to imagine it as something different. What does a world look like that is consistent with our values? And then you build it. It's not easy. It's definitely not expensive, not inexpensive. But at the end of the day, what I have seen communities begin to do is actually build something different. It's possible to be able to think about things a little bit differently. So if you want to learn more about who we are, we're Justice Innovation Lab. That's how you can find us. We do a bunch of stuff on LinkedIn as kind of our primary social media, but we also have all those other things. I guess it's X now. I got to change the bird. It's been a while since this graphic was made for me. If you're interested in learning, man, let's see. I also wrote a book. I can't even get it right now. I sort of like messed with my slides before. It's been a long day at the office. But I wrote a book. It's called Fire on the Levee. It is the story of an investigation that I led very early into my career. So if you're interested in police misconduct and how police misconduct cases are investigated, it is the case of a man whose body was found burned behind a levee in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. For 3.5 years, no one knew what had happened to him until an investigative journalist started looking into it and suggested that this man had last been seen in the custody of the New Orleans Police Department. So at the time, a young Jared Fishman was sent down to New Orleans to try to figure out whether or not there was anything to the allegations. Ultimately, we charged 5 police officers in conjunction with the killing and burning of Henry Glover and the cover-up that followed. The book follows the investigation. I tried to write it as a whodunit legal procedural to keep you on the edge of your seat for the entire time. But ultimately, my real goal was to help explain what is happening when we're trying to investigate these cases. Why are they so hard to bring, misconduct cases? But ultimately, how I think we can begin to think about some of this stuff differently so that perhaps we can design a better justice system. So that's what I got. Like happy to take questions, hear from you guys about what's interesting. I'm supposed to talk about AI, I think, a little bit, so I'm happy to talk a little bit about that. I mean, I guess a few high points is AI, particularly the AI where the computers are learning from themselves, depend on existing data in their training materials in order to come up with solutions. One thing that is important to know is that our criminal justice data in America is terrible, terrible. It is often not reliable. And so when we think about training algorithms to make decisions, I think it's really important to know that we've got to make sure that we're using good, clean data. What we also don't want to do is to reinforce biases that have existed for hundreds of years. If we know that there's disparities in how we police, and the algorithm's trying to figure out, well, what does a police officer do? If it keeps telling you to go back to the same neighborhood and arrest more people, that is highly problematic. So thinking through what our data sources are and really what are we trying to do when we're setting these things up.
Jared, thank you for that. It was a great overview. And students, I would open the floor to you for questions. Also potentially about professional development, if that is something where what you're interested in additional information around. I feel like this is a great opportunity for more information around that. Alternatively, for the students, recognizing that we were tasked with building the change that we want to see, and sort of future casting for final assignments based off of what we have learned this semester. What is the change that you would be most keen to see addressed?
I apologize. I'm walking home right now from work. But Jared, thank you so much for taking the time to come present to our class. Recently, I was taking a critical race theory class, and a peer of mine did a presentation on the school to prison pipeline. And I'm curious to see, like, what are your thoughts when it comes to the context of recidivism and whether you think it's an even broader, larger structural problem in America?
Yeah, I mean, it absolutely is a broader structural problem. For those of you who are fans of Maslow and his hierarchy of needs, right? If you're starting at the bottom of the pyramid where you lack access to housing or food or security, then you are way more likely to wind up in our system. It is hard to succeed when you're at that bottom rung of the hierarchy. That's a byproduct of generational poverty. It's a byproduct of redlining and the way neighborhoods were built. It's a byproduct of all sorts of things of a failed education system for a really long time. So absolutely, if we want to prevent crime, we need to get people off the bottom rung. Like that is probably the most essential thing that we need to do, whether it's secure housing, helping have secure employment. These are all things that have to happen. When we fail at any of those things, you're more likely to wind up in our system that is not particularly good at solving your problem that got you there in the first place. And so I think the next level of thinking is, and where we are trying to do, we're doing a project right now in Miami that's really focused on mental health, because they see that 50% of the people in their jails are suffering from severe mental health issues. right? And that's par for the course. I mean, I think in many jurisdictions, it's anywhere from 30 to 60%. I've heard those numbers thrown around. It's a lot of people. And why did that happen? Well, we had very abusive mental health institutions for a very long time. People were outraged. They appropriately decided that they should shut them down. However, they didn't come up with a replacement. This is one of the problems whenever you hear anyone that talks about tearing it all down. If you're gonna tear it all down, you have to simultaneously have a replacement. We did not have a replacement for mental health. So where do those people wind up? They wound up on the streets. They wound up interacting with our public safety officials, and they wound up in our jails and prisons. If you think of our system as being a system designed for public safety, like it was not a system designed for public safety. Our system was designed for punishment. That is its purpose. You do something wrong, we hold you morally accountable, and then you go to the penance hole, also known as the penitentiary, to go do your penance. Like that was what was built, that was what it was designed for. But now what happens is we're putting all sorts of people in that system that are not morally culpable. It's like it's hard pressed to find someone with mental health challenges who everyone's like, yes, we should punish that person. Even the most right of center prosecutors I've come up with don't really take that position. Well, but that's who's in there. So I think so much of this is figuring out these off ramps that are better able to address root causes.
Jared, thank you so much. Actually, I love that you brought up mental health concerns because a lot of my research that I've been doing for this last year is focused around implementing co-respondent models to police training to specifically identify mental health emergencies, because it seems like police officers are often aggravating a situation and are clearly not well equipped to handle mental health emergencies and deal with individuals who are mentally ill.
Yeah, and I think they're great models. I think they are just like way too small at this point. But like many of these things, you know, I think when you make policy, you need to do it with humility and test and pilot and make sure it's working. But to me, it seems like a way more cost-effective way. A lot of times when you hear law enforcement people talk about mental health response, the question is, do you need a person with a gun to respond or not? Is it that situation? Because the vast majority of them, you do not need a person with a gun to respond. And so in those particular situations, you need to send someone else who is not going to escalate the situation because the guy with the gun escalates the situation. So I think we're still very much in the early stages of figuring out where the efficacy is and how you can make that better. I think we will see a lot more of that in the coming years because it's just a smarter use of resources.
Jared, sorry to hog everyone's time right now, but just one quick last question. You mentioned a study done in a prison in Miami regarding inmates being mentally ill and just mental health challenges and concerns in that. Do you have any link or just like a phrase that I can Google to possibly find that? I would love to just take a look over that.
Yeah, if you search for Miami model mental health diversion, I think that will give you, let me see. I think this is the good one. Yeah, I'll pop it in. This is a great article that explains what they're doing. We can find various different things on that.
Got it. Thank you so much again.
Derek, Ahmed, any questions?
Yeah, I mean, we had an earlier speaker trying to talk about, like, we have a lot of data now coming in from body-worn cameras. That's good and bad and then a lot of these police departments are hiring like third-party services to review the data and use AI to interpret it. And it's got a lot of concerns and you know, how that's going to be adjudicated, you know, like used in a case. But to say that, like, so, but it's a good data point. Like to your point earlier, most of the justice, you know, data that we do have, yeah, I completely agree. Probably not great, but we are getting all this body camera footage. I don't know. I mean, my hope with AI is that the screening process that you mentioned, you know, maybe, you know, the AI can help, you know, like make that a bigger effort. But on the body worn camera side, you know, my hope also is like it, you know, it can improve. I mean, I don't, you know, it's got benefits and, you know, detriments with that use. I don't know if you can give any comment.
Yeah, I mean, I
Yeah.
see a few potential use cases. Number one, part of the reason that the backlogs are getting bigger and bigger is that the amount of digital evidence in cases has grown dramatically. When I was a prosecutor, you know, doing state level stuff, I had about a caseload of 200, 250 at a time, which felt like an enormous amount. Now people have 400 cases at a time, 500 cases at a time. Back in 2005, I didn't have a single piece of digital evidence. We used to get 911 calls on cassette tapes, and you had to get the player and you get the cassette, and then you had to like make a copy to send it to defense, right? Wasn't that long ago, unless you think I'm terribly old, but like, there weren't body worn cameras back then. Now, in a typical case, you might have 10 videos, 15 videos, of which hours of it are just people standing around doing nothing. So one of the things that I think AI can do, and I mean, this capability is already there, is to identify words or people or be able to get you to the part that you need to see. Like, when did the arrest happen? Right? Like now you can pop videos and AI and say, when did the formal arrest? And they can point to you when Miranda was read. Things like this. So I think there is to me, that's where I see the most immediate use case for this stuff is as a way of processing digital evidence. The other thing it can do is ensure that all the evidence is disclosed. I think there was this period of time where, you know, the FBI used to send me the case file on DVDs, and I'd get a box with like 9 DVDs. And part of I want to disclose all of this, but I got to protect identities of people. I got to protect witnesses. I gotta redact addresses. Well, that's really, really hard to do in that context. Now we can do it. And the question is what degree of accuracy we feel comfortable relying on. Because that's what's going to happen is people are going to run this stuff through AI. It might be 85%, you know, 85% successful redaction. Well, it's 15% failure. If that's like a witness identity, is that sufficient? I don't know. We've got to figure out what our tolerance for some of this stuff is. Same goes with transcripts. Like if we're going to begin using this as a transcription service in order to serve as evidence, what percentage of accuracy do we feel comfortable with so that we can accept that this transcript is a true and accurate reflection of what that person said? I don't know that I have any answers as to where one should define that, but those are the kinds of challenges. One of the things that I think is super interesting that AI can do that humans have never been able to do is then looking at some of these videos or police reports to try to identify trends. So, I mean, I once had a case, it was an excessive use of force with a taser. The officer tased this semi-conscious person 29 times over the course of a half an hour. And it was all on body worn. And this was right in the age where people were like, yeah, if there's body worn, you won't get abuse. And then, you know, I watched the video and it was clear as day. And I'm not like, why did no one else see this? And the answer was no one else watched it. So, right, part of it is, can we use these things as accountability tool? Can we use this to say, all right, well, there's a recent study that came out that was showing if we look at traffic stops, you can tell by the way the officer initially approached the car, the likelihood that it was going to result in the use of force. And not surprisingly, When they come in with guns blazing, when they come in using harsh language, way more likely to result in the use of force than when it starts with a polite interaction between the officer and the driver. So I think we will be able to see and do more of those things, and analyze a broad swath. What I think is really cool about data, which has never been a part of the American criminal legal system before the last 5 years, I think. We always, as lawyers, are trained to make a case-by-case decision, right? Look at the evidence, apply it to the law, make a decision in this case, and do it in a fair way. You can look at any decision anyone has made in the legal system and they can justify it. It's like it's rare that I've come up with a decision that cannot be justified. But when you pop it out to 50,000 feet and you're looking at tens of thousands of decisions, and we're actually saying, I don't really care what anyone's intent is in any individual cases, but I want to see how the system as a whole is processing this thing. Then we can see trends that are harder to walk away from. And what I also think is they're easier to address because we're not forced to say you are a bad person and that is why we are doing this. We are saying this system is failing the values that you say you care about. And it brings people to the table in a way more constructive way.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you. Yeah, absolutely. And just wanted to kind of go on with my research about like maybe not as guns blazing violence, but police use of deception, and interrogations and investigations. And like there's a lot of psych studies of like popular words used, and then like, AI and other things now tagging, those words, and like they can, whether a person's under like coercion or not, right? For those, for pleading guilty, and making a determination in that respect. So yeah, not just with violence, but even with the subtler stuff that police are allowed to do. That's been my research. So
yeah, and I think the key to being able to use AI is to effectively write your prompts. Like that is going to be the new skill set that we're all going to have to develop is how do I ask better questions? How do I frame my question in the right way? How do I make sure that we're grouping the right things together? And one of the things that I just learned about data is like it's so much about the grouping that what are you grouping in the same group? A lot of times when I see some publicly available data and it's like DV and they just like classify DV. Well, as a DV prosecutor, there's a big difference between the cycle of violence, domestic violence that is gradually escalating into like a serious confrontation. And much of what I saw, which were people who didn't know how to solve their problems, who happened to be familial, who were living in some pretty tough situations. Like they're different things. And so depending on which problem you're trying to address, you got to make sure that you're asking the right prompts, and putting things in the right buckets.
Go ahead, Melanie. Any questions from your side?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention what I've been dealing with this semester is I've been doing a research project on the Detroit Police Department, and from this point, from the academic standpoint, and I do have experience with the police. I worked for the SVU at Detroit Police for about a year, so I see both sides, and I've been having the problem. I see where the disparage comes in when academia tries to go at the police, and the police, are unwilling to work with them, and it seems like you have both sides as well. You worked as a prosecutor. I'm sure you had worked with the police as well and things like that. So I think I'm somewhere caught in the middle because I have both experiences. So this semester, it's like academia has bashed Detroit police before, so they're unwilling to work with us. And then, for example, like the mental health aspect, like we should send a separate team to go report to places. It's like, okay, well, you do that, and all it takes is one time where you send the mental health team and someone's head will get blown off. And then it's like, oh, we sent the wrong team. So basically, it's like the police are saying like it's easy for us to sit behind a desk and write, hey, you guys are doing this wrong, you need to do this. And then vice versa, the police, it's, you know, the academic points are saying, well, here's all of this data that we've been collecting and you're doing wrong. And I just see the conflict. That's where there's not going to be any movement or good change unless there's some kind of middle ground where both sides can meet and kind of work with one another. So I've been dealing with that this whole semester. It's been rough.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I always think about myself throughout my career is I've always been an outsider, but operating on the inside. I was working in war zones as an outsider, but like I was working with the highest levels of government as a civil rights lawyer, going into a community in the aftermath of a civil rights offense. Like I was an outsider coming in, but because I was with the Justice Department, I was able to get on the inside in terms of having tools that was able to do it. Now I am an outsider going into communities and looking at their data, but like I can function on the inside. I like that role. That to me is like a good space for me. I haven't realized that until fairly recently that was always what I did. And it's you know, a different approach. I think there is a place for the people on the outside who are shining a light, who are saying this thing is wrong and I don't need you to be my friend because this is this bad thing. However, when you are on the outside, they are not going to like you and cooperate with you.
Yeah.
So it's, you know, part of it is trying to figure out, well, what do I need? Like, do I need this to be? I like collaborative stuff. I mean, I think we can push people to do better, but that only works when they trust you. One of like the reason I got invited to go down to South Carolina and why she gave me 5 years worth of data on every prosecutorial decision in that community was because she trusted me personally. Like this was not about my work. My organization didn't even exist then. I had to build that around there. Now I hired people who also shared my values and who, by virtue of the way they showed up every day, gained the trust. And if you see what my team looks like, and you're like, will those people be able to gather the trust of the South Carolina prosecutor? You're like, no way. They love us down there. And I think it's partly because, I don't know, they tell me they don't want to be racist. I believe them. I'm willing to accept that. And I'm willing to now help them try to do better. That is like so much of the tension is in where historically like people feel like it's a gotcha. I give you my data and you're like looking to get me. No one wants to be in that situation. And that's why I think the framing that we've done where it's you're framing it around your values, you're framing like you choose what success looks like. I can tell you what I will advise you on what I think success could look like. I will advise you on what metrics I think are relevant because I've thought about this from a lot of different angles, but ultimately it's your community, you've got to make these decisions. But once they choose the metrics and they agree that the data is reliable, when you get those two things, well, the numbers are going to say what the numbers are going to say. You've now framed it where they have co-created, co-designed this. Now that's easier said than done. Listen, I've been at this stuff for 25 years, so I can do that. It's much harder when you're still in law school. But finding those different places and resources where you can do it.
Yeah, I agree. That it is a tough job. And just to speak to the technology standpoint, I worked a lot with like CODIS, you know, the DNA systems that the government uses and police use, and that was pretty high tech for me. But the AI stuff, yeah, I agree with you. I still feel like it's kind of at the beginning. But thanks for that.
Any other questions, comments, concerns, advice sought from our speaker? Well, Jared, I spent earlier quite a bit of time making a list for a class we're delivering on Monday about the different nonprofit organizations that are currently working on policing reform issues. And I found quite a bit of overlap in some of the work that they are doing. And so let me just tell you that from that perspective, it is wildly refreshing to hear from the Justice Innovation Lab, because I truly think that the work that y'all are doing is inherent in your name. I think you are doing some incredibly innovative work and approaches that I think we can certainly currently learn from and continue to learn from in your engagement and in your outputs. I think I'm encouraged by what you have done and what you continue to do. So thank you for that. And thank you for being with us on a Friday evening after a long week, after a weird news day. I don't know if what's happening in the world, but my phone, my feeds have been going all over the place with things happening both here in DC and across the world. So thank you for taking time. Hopefully we've been able to foster at least an hour and 15 minutes of some peace and interest in your work. Yes, thank you for being with us. We really appreciated learning from and with you today.
Great. Well, good luck, everyone.
Thank you.
Cheers.
The world needs more change makers. So go out into the world and do justice.
Thank you, Jared.
Thanks.
Bye.